December 23, 1944, 600 hours. The frozen clouds above Bastogne parted like curtains as the drone of aircraft engines shattered the pre-dawn silence. General Heinrich von Lüttwitz lowered his field glasses and turned to his aide, his face pale with recognition of what he was witnessing. Through the morning mist, 41 Douglas C-47 transport aircraft descended through German anti-aircraft fire, their cargo bays loaded with enough supplies to sustain an entire division. What von Lüttwitz observed that morning would fundamentally alter German understanding of American logistical capabilities. This was not merely a supply operation, this was industrial warfare projected vertically, democracy delivering victory from the skies with a precision and audacity that defied everything the Wehrmacht knew about siege warfare. The German general watched parachutes blossom across the Belgian sky like deadly flowers, each one carrying supplies that should have been impossible to deliver to an encircled garrison. The mathematics of what descended on Bastogne that morning were staggering. 144 tons of ammunition, medical supplies, food, and winter equipment dropped with surgical precision into a defensive perimeter, barely 4 miles in diameter. This single airdrop delivered more supplies than von Lüttwitz's entire 47th Panzer Corps had received in the previous week. The implications were catastrophic for German operational planning, which had calculated that the encircled Americans would surrender within 72 hours due to supply exhaustion. Standing in the church tower of Sibret, von Lüttwitz had come to personally observe what he expected to be the final American collapse. Instead, he witnessed something that violated every principle of siege warfare he had learned in 30 years of military service. The Americans were not starving, they were not running out of ammunition, they were being sustained by an aerial supply line that German forces could neither interdict nor replicate. His aide, Major Wilhelm Schramm, recorded von Lüttwitz's reaction in the division war diary that would later be captured by American forces. "Mein Gott," the general said, his voice barely audible above the continuing drone of aircraft engines. "No army can stop that. They are feeding their soldiers from the clouds. We cannot compete with the sky itself." Within hours, this observation would circulate through German command posts across the Ardennes, spreading a demoralization that would prove as damaging as any tactical defeat. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The siege of Bastogne had begun 4 days earlier when German forces, spearheading Operation Watch on Rhine, had surrounded the critical road junction defended by the 101st Airborne Division. The German plan was elegantly simple. Bastogne controlled 7 major roads, converging like spokes of a wheel. Whoever held the town controlled movement throughout the southern Ardennes. German commanders calculated that an encircled garrison, cut off from supply lines that stretched back to Normandy beaches, would inevitably surrender. This calculation was based on orthodox military doctrine that had governed siege warfare since ancient times. An army fought with the supplies it carried. When those supplies were exhausted, the army surrendered or faced annihilation. The Wehrmacht had applied this principle successfully across Europe, from Poland to France to the gates of Moscow. Encirclement meant inevitable defeat unless relief arrived quickly. The Americans encircled at Bastogne had neither sufficient supplies nor immediate prospect of relief. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, chief of Wehrmacht operations staff, had personally endorsed the Bastogne operation, noting in his staff conference on December 20th that the American airborne forces, though individually courageous, lack the logistical infrastructure to sustain prolonged defensive operations when isolated from their base. German intelligence estimated that American ammunition reserves would last 48 hours under combat conditions. Food supplies might stretch to 4 days with strict rationing. Medical supplies were assumed inadequate for casualties anticipated in urban fighting. What German planners had not anticipated was Operation Repulse, the American aerial resupply mission that would transform the siege of Bastogne from a German tactical victory into a strategic disaster. The operation represented the culmination of American air-land integration developed through 3 years of combat experience. Unlike the improvised airdrops that had characterized earlier airborne operations, The Bastogne supply mission employed systematic procedures refined through months of training and battlefield experience. The air resupply operation was conceived on December 21st when Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, radioed his ammunition status to 8th Corps headquarters. Artillery rounds were limited to 10 per gun per day. Small arms ammunition was rationed to essential defensive fires only. Medical supplies were critically low, with morphine reserves sufficient for perhaps 24 hours of combat operations. McAuliffe's radio message, intercepted by German intelligence, seemed to confirm Wehrmacht calculations about American supply constraints. What the Germans did not understand was that this message triggered a massive logistical response that would demonstrate American organizational capabilities beyond German comprehension. Within 6 hours, the 9th Troop Carrier Command had organized an emergency supply mission involving 3 transport groups, 41 aircraft, and supplies drawn from depots across England and France. The scale of the American response revealed systematic advantages that German logistics could not match. The C-47 aircraft employed in the mission were specifically modified for supply drops, equipped with reinforced cargo floors, specialized release mechanisms, and navigation equipment that allowed precision delivery in adverse weather. Each aircraft could carry 3.5 tons of supplies, delivering them with an accuracy that placed 80% of dropped materials within the designated landing zone. The supplies themselves reflected American industrial capacity applied to military logistics. Ammunition was packaged in standardized containers designed for air delivery, with impact-resistant casings that prevented explosive sympathetic detonation during rough landings. Medical supplies included sulfanilamide drugs that German forces lacked entirely, morphine syrets that allowed wounded soldiers to self-administer pain relief, and plasma containers that could be administered by medics with minimal training. Food supplies consisted of 10-in-1 rations, each package feeding 10 men for 1 day, designed specifically for rapid consumption under combat conditions. The German response to the American air resupply revealed the Wehrmacht's inability to counter industrial logistics with traditional military methods. Oberst Friedrich Kühne, commanding the 78th Infantry Division's artillery, had positioned his 88mm anti-aircraft guns in a defensive ring around Bastogne, specifically to interdict American supply flights. His guns represented the finest anti-aircraft weapons in the German arsenal, served by crews trained to engage high-altitude bombers flying in formation. Yet, when the American transport aircraft appeared at dawn on December 23rd, Kühne discovered that his defensive preparations were inadequate for the mission. The C-47s approached at low altitude, using terrain, masking to avoid detection until the final approach. They flew individually rather than in formation, presenting multiple targets that divided German fire and prevented concentrated engagement. Most critically, they operated with fighter escort that immediately engaged German anti-aircraft positions, forcing gun crews to choose between engaging transports or defending themselves against strafing attacks. Kühne's after-action report, discovered in German archives, described his growing frustration as American aircraft continued to deliver supplies despite his defensive measures. Each aircraft that we engaged was immediately replaced by another, he wrote. When we concentrated fire on individual targets, escort fighters suppressed our positions. When we dispersed fire across multiple targets, our effectiveness decreased to negligible levels. The Americans possessed more aircraft than we had ammunition to engage them. The precision of American supply drops particularly impressed German observers who had experienced their own air resupply attempts earlier in the war. Major Hans Gruber, intelligence officer with the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, had observed German supply drops during the Stalingrad operation and noted the stark differences in execution. German transport aircraft had approached at high altitude to avoid anti-aircraft fire, resulting in supply dispersal over wide areas. Much of the dropped material landed outside German lines, providing supplies to Soviet forces rather than intended recipients. American aircraft approached Bastogne at altitudes below 1,000 feet, accepting anti-aircraft fire to ensure supply accuracy. Drop zones were marked by ground panels visible from aircraft, with radio communication between transport crews and ground controllers, ensuring precise delivery timing. Parachute release was synchronized with ground signals, placing supplies within predetermined areas that American forces could secure immediately upon landing. The psychological impact of the American supply operation extended beyond the material support it provided. German forces surrounding Bastogne had been assured by their commanders that the encircled Americans would surrender within days due to supply exhaustion. When supplies continued to arrive by air, German morale suffered accordingly. Unteroffizier Heinrich Wolf, serving with the 5th Parachute Division, recorded in his diary the demoralizing effect of watching American aircraft deliver supplies that his own unit desperately needed. "Every morning they come," Wolf wrote on December 24th. "Every morning the sky fills with American aircraft dropping food, ammunition, medicine to soldiers who should be starving. Our officers promised us the Americans would surrender today, yesterday, tomorrow. Instead, they grow stronger while we grow weaker. How can we defeat an enemy who eats from the clouds?" The technical execution of the Bastogne supply drops demonstrated American mastery of complex military operations that required integration across multiple services and specialized units. The 9th Troop Carrier Command coordinated with the 8th and 9th Air Forces to provide fighter escort, with ground forces to establish secure landing zones, and with supply organizations across the European theater to assemble appropriate materials. This level of coordination, executed under combat conditions within 48 hours of initial planning, revealed organizational capabilities that impressed German professional officers. General der Infanterie Baptist Nies, commanding the 85th Army Corps, observed the American supply operation from his headquarters in Hafeleis and immediately recognized its implications for German strategic planning. His intelligence staff had calculated that American forces required specific quantities of supplies to maintain defensive effectiveness. Artillery ammunition consumption could be predicted based on historical data. Food requirements were determined by unit strength. Medical supply needs could be estimated from casualty rates. The American air resupply operation invalidated these calculations by demonstrating that encirclement did not necessarily constrain American logistical capabilities. If American forces could be sustained indefinitely by air, then German siege tactics became irrelevant. Encirclement, which had been a decisive tactical advantage throughout the war, was neutralized by American technological and organizational superiority. Knies immediately forwarded his assessment to Army Group B headquarters, noting that the enemy possesses aerial supply capabilities that render traditional siege operations ineffective. American forces can apparently be sustained indefinitely, regardless of ground-based supply lines. This fundamentally alters the tactical calculation for all future operations involving American forces. The broader implications of the Bastogne supply drops became clear as the siege continued into its second week. Rather than weakening under supply constraints, American defensive effectiveness actually increased as air-delivered supplies accumulated within the perimeter. Artillery fire, which had been carefully rationed during the first days of encirclement, resumed normal intensity. Medical care for wounded improved as supplies of sulfanilamide and morphine allowed treatment that had been impossible with limited stocks. Most importantly, American morale remained high despite prolonged encirclement. German psychological warfare specialists had predicted that isolated American forces would suffer progressive demoralization as their situation became hopeless. Instead, American soldiers interpreted the daily supply drops as evidence that their situation was temporary, that higher headquarters retained confidence in their ability to hold Bastogne, and that eventual relief was inevitable. This psychological resilience frustrated German tactical planning, which had assumed that prolonged siege would reduce American fighting effectiveness through attrition and demoralization. Instead, American forces continued to conduct aggressive defensive operations, including counterattacks that recaptured ground initially lost to German assault. The garrison that should have been desperate was acting with confidence, characteristic of troops confident in their supply situation and ultimate victory. The German assessment of American supply capabilities was further complicated by the diversity of materials delivered during the air resupply operations. Beyond basic combat necessities like ammunition and medical supplies, American aircraft delivered items that German forces considered luxuries inappropriate for soldiers under siege. K rations included cigarettes, chocolate, and instant coffee. Medical supplies included dental care items and sanitation materials. Winter equipment included wool socks, insulated boots, and sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures. This abundance revealed American logistical thinking that prioritized soldier welfare beyond mere survival. German forces, accustomed to shortages that forced choice between essential items, could not comprehend an army that provided complete support even under the most adverse conditions. The Americans were not merely surviving the siege, they were maintaining living standards that exceeded what many German soldiers experienced in garrison conditions. Major Wilhelm Osterhold, adjutant to the commanding general of the 47th Panzer Corps, documented his observations of American air resupply in a report that later influenced German assessments of American capabilities. The enemy supply operation reveals systematic abundance that exceeds immediate tactical requirements, he wrote. They drop not only ammunition but cigarettes, not only medical supplies but recreational materials, not only food but luxuries. This suggests supply capabilities so extensive that they can afford to provide non-essential items even under combat conditions. Osterhold's analysis identified a fundamental difference in logistical philosophy that distinguished American from German military organization. German logistics emphasized efficiency, providing exactly what was needed with minimal waste. American logistics emphasized redundancy, providing everything that might be useful with abundance that ensured availability. This philosophical difference reflected broader contrasts between industrial systems that would determine the outcome of mechanized warfare. The evolution of American air resupply techniques during the Bastogne siege demonstrated the systematic improvement that characterized American military operations throughout the war. The initial supply drop on December 23 achieved approximately 70% accuracy, with 30% of supplies landing outside American lines. By December 26, accuracy had improved to over 90% through refined navigation procedures, better ground-air communication, and adjusted release altitudes. This rapid improvement reflected American institutional learning that German commanders found particularly troubling. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized individual excellence and tactical innovation by experienced officers. American doctrine emphasized systematic procedures that could be executed effectively by average personnel with appropriate training. The result was that American operations generally improved over time, while German operations often deteriorated as experienced personnel became casualties. Colonel Heinz Kokott, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division directly engaged with American forces in Bastogne, observed this systematic improvement in American performance with growing concern. His initial attacks against American positions had achieved limited success against defenders who seemed unfamiliar with urban combat techniques. However, American defensive effectiveness improved daily as units learned from experience and adapted their tactics to local conditions. Kokott attributed this improvement partially to the psychological effect of continued supply, which maintained American morale and confidence. But he also noted evidence of institutional learning that suggested American forces were receiving tactical guidance through the same communication channels that coordinated supply operations. Radio intercepts revealed that American units were sharing lessons learned, requesting specific types of support, and coordinating defensive measures across the entire perimeter. This integration of tactical learning with logistical support created a defensive system that grew stronger rather than weaker under pressure. German forces, by contrast, were experiencing progressive degradation as ammunition shortages, forced rationing, fuel constraints limited tactical mobility, and communication disruptions prevented coordination between units. The siege that was supposed to weaken American resistance was instead revealing American systematic advantages that German tactical skill could not overcome. The medical dimension of American air resupply particularly impressed German observers who had experience with Wehrmacht medical services under similar conditions. Dr. Heinrich Buchner, a German army surgeon captured during fighting around Bastogne, later testified about the contrast between American and German medical capabilities under siege conditions. German wounded were evacuated to rear areas when possible, but received minimal treatment when evacuation was impossible due to transportation shortages and limited medical supplies. American wounded within the Bastogne perimeter received medical treatment that exceeded what many German soldiers received in base hospitals. Airdropped medical supplies included surgical instruments, anesthetics, antibiotics, and plasma for transfusions. American medics were trained to perform procedures that German doctrine reserved for qualified surgeons. The result was that American casualties had significantly higher survival rates, which contributed to maintaining unit effectiveness throughout the siege. This medical superiority had tactical implications that German commanders initially underestimated. American units could sustain higher casualty rates without losing combat effectiveness, because wounded soldiers returned to duty more quickly and in better condition. German units experiencing equivalent casualties often became combat ineffective because wounded soldiers either died from inadequate medical care or required long recovery periods before returning to duty. The propaganda value of American medical capabilities also influenced German morale. German soldiers attacking American positions knew that capture might actually improve their medical care, since American medical supplies and training exceeded German capabilities. This knowledge reduced German fighting determination and increased surrender rates, particularly among wounded German soldiers, who recognized that American captivity offered better medical treatment than continued service with German forces. The logistical complexity of the Bastogne air resupply operation revealed American organizational capabilities that German staff officers struggled to comprehend. Each supply drop required coordination between air crews trained in low-altitude navigation, ground controllers familiar with radio procedures, supply personnel who assembled appropriate material packages, meteorological services that provided weather data for flight planning, and fighter units that provided escort protection. This level of inter-service coordination, executed repeatedly under combat conditions, demonstrated institutional sophistication that the Wehrmacht had never achieved. German logistics relied heavily on staff officers with extensive experience who could coordinate complex operations through personal relationships and informal procedures. American logistics employed systematic processes that functioned effectively regardless of personnel changes. When individual American officers became casualties, their replacements could assume responsibilities immediately because procedures were standardized and documented. When German staff officers became casualties, their specialized knowledge was lost and operations suffered accordingly. This systematic approach to military operations represented a fundamental transformation in warfare that German professional officers recognized but could not replicate. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division and one of the Wehrmacht's most respected tacticians, later testified about his assessment of American organizational methods. They fought not as individual soldiers but as components of a machine, he told American interrogators. Each man performed his function efficiently, but the machine itself was more important than any individual. We Germans fought as warriors. They fought as workers in a factory of war. The Christmas Eve supply drop on December 24th represented the culmination of American air resupply capabilities at Bastogne. Despite deteriorating weather conditions that grounded most aircraft across the European theatre, 41 C-47 transports delivered 160 tons of supplies with precision that German observers described as impossible. The weather that morning included cloud cover at 300 feet, intermittent snow squalls, and surface winds exceeding 20 miles per hour. German meteorological services had assessed these conditions as prohibitive for air operations. Yet American aircraft appeared precisely on schedule, navigating through clouds by instrument flight procedures that German pilots had not mastered. The transports descended through the overcast at predetermined coordinates, released their cargo loads within the American defensive perimeter, and withdrew before German anti-aircraft fire could achieve effective engagement. This demonstration of all-weather operational capability convinced German commanders that American air superiority was not merely quantitative but qualitative, representing training and equipment standards that the Luftwaffe could no longer match. Oberst Werner Mölders, operations officer with the 2nd Parachute Corps, witnessed the Christmas Eve supply drop from his observation post in Margaret and immediately understood its implications for German defensive planning throughout Western Europe. If American forces could be sustained by air, regardless of weather conditions or ground-based supply lines, then German strategy based on cutting Allied communications and forcing logistical failure was fundamentally flawed. His assessment, forwarded to Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B headquarters, noted that the enemy possesses weather-independent supply capabilities that neutralize our primary tactical advantage. We cannot interdict their logistics because their logistics operate above our reach. Every American position is potentially supplied indefinitely, making our traditional siege tactics obsolete. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological warfare dimension of American air resupply operations created effects that German propaganda specialists could not counter. Wehrmacht morale services had developed sophisticated techniques for undermining enemy fighting spirit through psychological pressure, isolation, and exploitation of supply difficulties. These methods had proven effective against Soviet forces during the early war years and against various resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. The Bastogne garrison presented a textbook case for psychological warfare application. American forces were surrounded, outnumbered, and apparently cut off from support. German propaganda loudspeakers broadcast surrender demands, emphasizing the hopelessness of American situation and the inevitable consequences of continued resistance. Leaflets dropped into American positions detailed the fate awaiting forces that continued fighting against overwhelming odds. These psychological operations backfired completely when American supply aircraft appeared daily overhead, demonstrating that American forces were neither abandoned nor hopeless. Each successful supply drop provided visual evidence that American higher command retained confidence in the Bastogne garrison and possessed the capability to sustain them indefinitely. German propaganda claims about American isolation and desperation were contradicted by physical evidence falling from the sky. Private First Class Hans Wegener, serving with the 78th Volksgrenadier Division, and later captured during the final German retreat from the Ardennes, described the demoralization German soldiers experienced when watching American supply operations. "Our officers told us the Americans were trapped, starving, finished," he recalled during interrogation. "Then every morning we watched their aircraft bring them everything they needed. We began to understand that our officers either did not know the truth or were lying to us. Either possibility was disturbing." The technical evolution of American supply drop procedures during the Bastogne siege demonstrated the rapid adaptation that characterized American military operations throughout the war. Initial drops on December 23rd had achieved acceptable accuracy, but revealed procedural inefficiencies that American personnel addressed through systematic analysis and modification. Drop altitudes were lowered to improve accuracy despite increased vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire. Release timing was refined to account for wind conditions and aircraft speed variations. Ground marking procedures were standardized to ensure consistent target identification. By December 26th, American supply drops were achieving 95% accuracy, with virtually all dropped materials landing within American defensive positions. This improvement occurred during active combat operations, under adverse weather conditions, with aircraft crews under anti-aircraft fire. The ability to refine complex procedures while executing them under combat stress impressed German observers who recognized the institutional sophistication this represented. Hauptmann Klaus Riedel, intelligence officer with the 5th Parachute Division, had been assigned to analyze American supply procedures and develop countermeasures. His report, captured when his unit surrendered in January 1945, detailed his conclusions about American organizational capabilities. "The enemy improves their operations daily through systematic analysis and procedural modification," he wrote. "They treat warfare as an engineering problem requiring continuous refinement rather than an art requiring individual brilliance. This approach produces steady improvement in performance that our traditional methods cannot match." The material abundance revealed through American supply drops provided German forces with detailed intelligence about American industrial capabilities that had previously been estimated rather than observed. Each captured supply container yielded information about American manufacturing capacity, quality control standards, and logistical distribution systems. Ammunition was packaged in standardized containers with lot numbers indicating production dates and manufacturing locations. Medical supplies included expiration dates revealing inventory turnover rates. Food packaging displayed nutritional information and production specifications. This intelligence painted a picture of American industrial capacity that German economic analysts had underestimated. The United States was not merely producing sufficient military supplies, but was maintaining quality standards that exceeded German peacetime manufacturing. American soldiers in combat were receiving equipment and supplies superior to what German civilians had access to before the war began. Oberst Heinrich Böhmer, quartermaster of the 47th Panzer Corps, compiled a detailed analysis of captured American supplies that revealed the systematic superiority of American logistics. American ammunition was manufactured to tighter tolerances than German artillery shells, reducing misfires and improving accuracy. American medical supplies included drugs that German pharmaceutical companies had discontinued due to raw material shortages. American rations provided nutritional content that exceeded German army standards and equaled civilian diet standards from pre-war Germany. "We are not fighting an army," Böhmer concluded in his report. "We are fighting an industrial system that has converted its entire productive capacity to military purposes without sacrificing quality or abundance. They possess resources so extensive that they can afford to provide luxury items to soldiers under siege conditions." The strategic implications of successful American air resupply at Bastogne extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German operational planning for the Ardennes offensive had depended on rapid capture of key road junctions that would disrupt Allied supply lines and force American forces to fight under logistical constraints. Bastogne was crucial to this strategy because it controlled 7 major highways that German forces needed for their advance toward Antwerp. The ability of American forces to hold Bastogne indefinitely through air resupply invalidated the entire German operational concept. Instead of capturing vital supply routes, German forces found themselves committed to a prolonged siege that consumed resources while contributing nothing to the broader offensive. Meanwhile, American forces used Bastogne as a base for defensive operations that tied down German units and prevented their redeployment to more critical sectors. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Freiherr von Lüttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps responsible for capturing Bastogne, recognized this strategic failure and requested permission to bypass the town and continue the advance westward. His request was denied by higher headquarters, which insisted that Bastogne must be captured to secure German supply lines for the continued offensive. This decision committed German forces to exactly the kind of attritional warfare that favored American logistical advantages. Von Lüttwitz's war diary, captured after his surrender in April 1945, revealed his growing understanding that the Bastogne operation had become a strategic disaster for German forces. "We are besieging a fortress that grows stronger daily while we grow weaker," he wrote on December 27th. "The Americans receive everything they need from the sky, while we receive nothing. They are not trapped. We are trapped by our own decision to attack them." The intelligence implications of American air resupply capabilities forced German strategic planners to reassess their fundamental assumptions about Allied vulnerabilities. Wehrmacht doctrine had emphasized that American forces, fighting far from their industrial base, would be constrained by extended supply lines that German forces could interdict through operational maneuver and tactical action. The Bastogne supply drops demonstrated that American logistics possessed redundancy and flexibility that made traditional interdiction methods ineffective. German intelligence services, already strained by the need to monitor Soviet capabilities on the Eastern Front, were forced to devote additional resources to understanding American logistical systems that seemed to violate established military principles. How could an army maintain supply lines that operated through the air? How could aircraft deliver supplies with precision that exceeded artillery accuracy? How could industrial production sustain such abundant supply that luxury items were included in combat deliveries? Oberst Reinhard Gehlen, Chief of Wehrmacht Intelligence Services for the Eastern Front, but temporarily assigned to analyze American capabilities, concluded that German intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American military power. We assessed their army as large but inefficient, their industry as productive but wasteful, their logistics as abundant but vulnerable, he reported to Wehrmacht High Command. We failed to recognize that apparent inefficiency was actually redundancy, that apparent waste was actually abundance, and that apparent vulnerability was actually flexibility. The medical dimension of American air resupply operations provided German forces with direct evidence of American technological and organizational superiority in areas that affected soldier welfare and combat effectiveness. Airdropped medical supplies included sulfanilamide drugs that dramatically reduced infection rates in wounded soldiers, plasma containers that allowed treatment of shock and blood loss under field conditions, and morphine syrettes that provided pain relief while maintaining soldier mobility. German medical services had experienced progressive degradation throughout the war as pharmaceutical production was disrupted by Allied bombing and raw materials became unavailable due to blockade effects. German soldiers wounded at Bastogne received medical treatment that was inferior to what American soldiers had received in 1942. The contrast was stark and demoralizing, particularly for German medical personnel who recognized the life-saving potential of American medical supplies. Dr. Hans Killian, a Wehrmacht surgeon serving with the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, later testified about his observations of American medical capabilities during the Bastogne fighting. Their wounded received treatment that our specialists could not provide in base hospitals, he told American interrogators. They had drugs we had heard about but never seen, equipment we had read about in medical journals but never used, and procedures we understood theoretically but could not implement due to supply constraints. The psychological impact on German medical personnel extended beyond professional admiration to personal demoralization. German doctors had entered military service believing that German medical science led the world and that German organization would ensure adequate support for their work. The reality of treating German wounded with inadequate supplies while observing superior American medical capabilities created cognitive dissonance that affected morale throughout German medical services. The evolution of German anti-aircraft defenses around Bastogne revealed the inability of traditional military solutions to counter American logistical innovation. German forces committed increasing numbers of anti-aircraft guns to interdicting American supply flights, drawing these weapons from air defense of critical targets throughout the rear areas. 88mm guns, 20mm cannon, and multiple machine gun positions created a defensive ring that should have made low-altitude supply drops prohibitively dangerous. Yet American supply operations continued with acceptable loss rates, while German anti-aircraft positions became vulnerable to American fighter-bomber attacks that were coordinated with supply missions. American escort fighters systematically suppressed German anti-aircraft positions, allowing transport aircraft to complete their missions while inflicting casualties on German gun crews and destroying irreplaceable equipment. The tactical result was that German forces found themselves in a losing exchange where they committed increasing resources to counter American supply operations without achieving decisive results. Meanwhile, American forces used the predictable location of German anti-aircraft positions to target them with artillery fire and air attacks that gradually degraded German defensive capabilities. Oberst Friedrich Kühne, commanding the anti-aircraft defenses around Bastogne, documented this tactical failure in reports that revealed the systematic nature of American air-land integration. The enemy coordinates their supply missions with fighter operations and artillery fire, he wrote. When we concentrate anti-aircraft fire against their transport aircraft, their fighters attack our gun positions. When we disperse our guns to avoid fighter attack, our anti-aircraft fire becomes ineffective against transport aircraft. They have created a system where every countermeasure we employ creates vulnerabilities they can exploit. The logistical complexity of American air resupply operations became fully apparent when German forces captured detailed American planning documents during a failed attack on December 28. These documents, discovered in the effects of a killed American supply officer, revealed the systematic procedures that enabled seemingly impossible supply operations under adverse conditions. Supply loads were calculated based on unit requirements transmitted by radio using standardized reporting procedures. Weather analysis determined aircraft routing and delivery altitudes using meteorological data collected by specialized reconnaissance flights. Navigation was coordinated using radio beacons and ground-air communication procedures that allowed precise timing despite adverse weather conditions. Fighter escort was integrated with transport operations using communication frequencies and coordination procedures that enabled real-time tactical adjustment. Major Wilhelm Schramm, intelligence officer with the 47th Panzer Corps, analyzed these captured documents and concluded that American air resupply represented organizational sophistication that the Wehrmacht could not replicate. "They have systematized what we approach through improvisation," he reported. "Every procedure is documented, standardized, and practiced until it can be executed under any conditions. We rely on individual competence and tactical flexibility. They rely on systematic procedures and institutional capability." The Christmas Day supply drop represented a watershed moment in German assessment of American capabilities. Despite weather conditions that had grounded all German aircraft and forced postponement of planned German attacks, American transport aircraft delivered supplies to Bastogne with routine efficiency that demonstrated weather-independent operational capability. German meteorological services had classified the weather as prohibitive for air operations, yet American aircraft operated as if weather was merely another tactical factor to be managed rather than a decisive constraint. This demonstration of all-weather capability forced German planners to recognize that American air superiority was not merely quantitative, but represented qualitative advantages in training, equipment, and procedures that the Luftwaffe could no longer match. If American aircraft could operate effectively in conditions that grounded German planes, then weather no longer provided the tactical advantages that German forces had relied upon throughout the war. The relief of Bastogne on December 26 by elements of General George Patton's Third Army marked the culmination of American systematic superiority over German tactical excellence. German forces had fought skillfully and courageously, employing tactics refined through years of combat experience against numerically superior enemies. Yet American logistics had enabled sustained defensive operations that absorbed German attacks, while American mobility had enabled rapid redeployment of forces that broke through German defensive positions. The Third Army's relief operation represented the same systematic approach to warfare that characterized American air resupply operations. Multiple routes were reconnoitered and prepared to ensure continued advance despite German defensive efforts. Artillery support was massed from units across several divisions to provide overwhelming firepower. Air support was coordinated to suppress German positions and interdict German reinforcements. Supply operations were planned to sustain continuous offensive operations, regardless of tactical setbacks. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, whose Panzer Lehr division attempted to block the American relief column, later testified about his recognition that German tactical skill could not overcome American systematic superiority. "We fought brilliantly, according to established doctrine," he told interrogators. "We positioned our forces well, coordinated our defensive fires effectively, and executed counterattacks with precision. Yet we failed because the Americans brought capabilities we could not match. They had more artillery than we had ammunition, more aircraft than we had anti-aircraft guns, more supplies than we could interdict." The strategic consequences of the Bastogne air resupply operation extended throughout German planning for the remainder of the war. Wehrmacht doctrine had assumed that American forces, despite their material advantages, remained vulnerable to operational maneuver that could separate them from their supply bases and force them to fight under logistical constraints. The Bastogne operation demonstrated that American logistics possessed flexibility and redundancy that made such operational approaches ineffective. German strategic planning after Bastogne increasingly emphasized defensive operations designed to inflict maximum casualties on American forces rather than operational maneuvers designed to achieve decisive victories. This represented recognition that German forces could no longer create conditions where American material advantages would be neutralized by logistical constraints. The war had become a contest of attrition, where American industrial capacity provided decisive advantages that German tactical skill could not overcome. General der Infanterie Baptist Knies, commanding the 85th Army Corps during the Bastogne operation, provided a comprehensive assessment of American capabilities that influenced German strategic thinking for the remainder of the war. "The enemy has solved the fundamental problem of modern warfare," he reported to Army Group B headquarters. "They can sustain military operations indefinitely, regardless of geographical constraints or tactical setbacks. We cannot defeat an enemy whose logistics operate independently of terrain, weather, or our interdiction efforts." The technological innovations demonstrated during the Bastogne air resupply operations provided German technical specialists with detailed intelligence about American capabilities that revealed the systematic nature of American military development. Captured supply containers included equipment and materials that demonstrated American industrial capacity to produce specialized military items at quality levels that exceeded German civilian production standards. Navigation equipment recovered from crashed American aircraft revealed American advances in radio technology and precision instruments that enabled all-weather flight operations. Communication equipment captured during ground fighting demonstrated American radio capabilities that provided reliable coordination between air and ground forces under conditions that disrupted German communications. Supply packaging revealed American development of specialized containers and parachute systems designed specifically for combat resupply operations. This technological intelligence forced German technical services to recognize that American military development represented not isolated innovations but a systematic advancement across all areas of military technology. While German research had focused on developing revolutionary weapons like jet aircraft and ballistic missiles, American development had focused on improving existing systems to achieve maximum reliability and effectiveness under combat conditions. The institutional learning demonstrated by American forces during the Bastogne siege provided German observers with insights into American military culture that explained their systematic superiority in complex operations. American units routinely analyzed their performance after each mission, identifying procedural improvements that were immediately implemented in subsequent operations. This created a continuous improvement process that enhanced effectiveness throughout prolonged operations. German military culture emphasized individual excellence and tactical flexibility that enabled brilliant performance by exceptional leaders, but did not systematically improve average performance across all units. American military culture emphasized procedural excellence and systematic training that enabled consistent performance by average personnel and created institutional capabilities that functioned regardless of individual leadership. Equality. Major Hans Gruber, captured during the final German retreat from the Ardennes and later employed as a translator for American intelligence services, observed this cultural difference during his captivity. "They treated every operation as a learning opportunity," he noted in his memoir, written after the war. "They analyzed what worked, what failed, and why. They distributed lessons learned throughout their organization immediately. They improved continuously because they learned systematically rather than depending on individual genius." The propaganda implications of successful American air resupply operations created effects throughout German military and civilian morale that German information services could not counter effectively. German propaganda had emphasized American material abundance, but suggested that this abundance reflected waste and inefficiency rather than genuine capability. The Bastogne air resupply operations provided visual evidence that American abundance translated directly into military effectiveness under the most challenging conditions. German soldiers who witnessed American supply operations could no longer believe propaganda claims about American weakness or inevitable German victory. German civilians who learned about American capabilities through soldier accounts began questioning official information about the war's progress. German leadership found itself unable to explain how German forces could achieve victory against an enemy whose capabilities seemed to exceed German comprehension. The psychological transformation within German military leadership became apparent in captured documents and post-war testimonies that revealed growing recognition of inevitable defeat. Officers who had begun the Ardennes offensive, confident in German tactical superiority, ended the operation, understanding that American systematic advantages made German victory impossible, regardless of tactical brilliance or fighting determination. The final German assessment of American air resupply capabilities was compiled by Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Wehrmacht Operations Staff, in a report prepared for Adolf Hitler on January 2, 1945. The report noted that the enemy possesses logistical capabilities that render traditional military planning obsolete. They can sustain forces indefinitely regardless of geographical isolation or supply line interdiction. Our tactical advantages are neutralized by their systematic superiority in organization, equipment, and industrial support. Jodl's report recommended strategic withdrawal to defensible positions, where German forces could inflict maximum casualties on American forces while conserving German strength, the inevitable final battle. This represented acknowledgement that German forces could no longer achieve operational objectives against American capabilities, demonstrated at Bastogne and throughout the Ardennes offensive. The legacy of the Bastogne air resupply operations extended far beyond their immediate tactical impact to influence military thinking about logistics, air power, and systematic warfare that would shape military doctrine for decades after World War II. American success in sustaining encircled forces through air resupply became a model for subsequent military operations from the Berlin airlift through modern special operations. More fundamentally, the Bastogne operation demonstrated the transformation of warfare from an art dependent on individual genius to a science dependent on systematic capability. German officers who witnessed American air resupply operations recognized that they were observing the future of warfare where victory belonged not to the most tactically skilled army, but to the most systematically organized military system. The mathematical precision of American supply operations, the redundancy that enabled continuous effectiveness despite casualties and equipment losses, the integration of multiple services and specialized capabilities, all represented approaches to warfare that emphasized systematic excellence over individual brilliance. This transformation reflected broader changes in modern society, where industrial organization and technological capability determined national power more than traditional military virtues. German professional officers, educated in military traditions that emphasized individual excellence and tactical flexibility, found themselves defeated by institutional capabilities that functioned independently of individual leadership quality. The Americans had industrialized warfare in the same way they had industrialized manufacturing, creating systems that produced consistent results through standardized procedures rather than depending on exceptional performance by gifted individuals. The testimonies of German officers who witnessed American air resupply operations at Bastogne provide historical insight into this transformation of warfare and its broader implications for understanding modern military power. Their accounts reveal not merely tactical observations, but recognition of fundamental changes in the nature of warfare that German military thinking had failed to anticipate or understand. General Heinrich von Lüttwitz, whose observation of American supply aircraft had triggered the psychological transformation described throughout this account, provided a final assessment that captured the totality of German military failure to comprehend American capabilities. "We prepared to fight the American army," he told his interrogators in May 1945. "Instead, we found ourselves fighting American industry, American organization, American abundance projected onto the battlefield with systematic precision. We were not defeated by better soldiers, but by a better system." The words, "No army can stop that," spoken by numerous German officers who witnessed American supply operations at Bastogne, became prophetic of Germany's inevitable defeat in World War II. They represented recognition that modern warfare had evolved beyond traditional military concepts to encompass industrial capacity, organizational efficiency, and systematic logistics as decisive factors in determining victory. The C-47 aircraft that descended through German anti-aircraft fire to deliver supplies to the Bastogne garrison were carrying more than ammunition, medical supplies, and food. They were carrying the future of warfare, A future where victory belonged to nations that could transform their entire industrial capacity into military capability and project that capability anywhere in the world, with systematic precision and unlimited abundance. German officers who watched those aircraft understood that they were witnessing the end of European military dominance and the emergence of American power based not on traditional military virtues, but on industrial democracy, technological innovation, and systematic organization applied to warfare with devastating effectiveness. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.